Well, hello and welcome. So we welcome you to day 4 of the Wellbeing Australia First Responders Summit. We've had amazing conversations all week, and today we're very excited to bring you some new discussions and some new areas of focus that we feel will be really valuable in the conversations we've been having. Just to get us started and to share a little bit more about us, Wellbeing Australia is a not-for-profit that is a members-based organisation. So that means that we don't take any funding from any government organisations or associations, and everything we do is designed by our members and community for our members and community. So the beauty of that is there is no other agenda. We are genuinely here to respond to what we are hearing is relevant to you and important in terms of your world and your own well-being. So that brings us to today in terms of the First Responders Summit and where that's come from. And I'll share a little bit more about our themes and where this entire conversation started. Before I do that, it is important to remember Wellbeing Australia is a national organisation. This summit has had global reach as well. So we aren't limited to one state, one agency, one organisation. We're very broad in terms of who we are supporting and how we're supporting them. So today's summit is very much focused on you as an individual, and we've had the beauty of people dialing in who have been family or friends of first responders. They may be first responders past or present, still continuing in service, moving between agencies, senior leaders through to people just starting out their careers. And we've been really humbled and thrilled to have such a diverse community join us. The aim of the summit was really about us being able to identify those unique needs. What is different for first responders when we're talking about wellbeing? What are those unique challenges? What differentiates you and those people around you in terms of those needs that you have? So from that, we identified a theme that was very, very strong and consistent from those we were speaking with, and that's about living well. And we talk about and we want to live well, but what does that actually look like? And we believe that that's through 3 key foundation stones. First, connection. So connection with yourself and connection with others, and that awareness. With hope, and so having that hope that even when I am in a difficult space or I'm facing crisis, I know I will be in a better space soon or at another stage. And community, and that's the sense of community within organisations, within areas and locations, but also within my own social world and those sorts of spaces. So it is really critical that we remember those different elements as to what we're talking about and what we're looking at. So today's sessions are a little bit different from those that we've had. We've had some fabulous conversations, and it has highlighted a couple of themes of real importance. So today's session will be slightly different. We have 2 unique presentations for you that will be shared in a moment. As with everything, it is being recorded, so you can access it if there is any reason that you need to pop out. Now, if you look at the bottom of your screen just before we start, there is a Q&A button down there. If you have questions for our speakers, please share them in the Q&A. You can make yourself anonymous in that space, and you can then allow us to pose those questions. Because it is a presentation forum, we will save questions for the end of each presentation so that we make sure that we give the speakers time to share that concept and that idea that they're actually bringing to us. So without further ado, I'm actually going to share and introduce our first speaker, Rima. So thank you so much for joining, Rima. Rima has been instrumental and heavily involved in our steering committee in determining what is important and where things are coming to from that first responder space and where the needs were and what we need to do to support more. So we've actually invited Rima to speak today about something that is a thing we've heard a lot about through the last few days, but definitely in the space of working with first responders, is that concept of a sense of belonging. So Rima, I will hand over to you. You may want to pop that on presentation mode and we are all good to go.
Thank you. Now, I'm wondering if you can see that screen at all.
I can. Do you mind just putting it on presentation view? Because it's just on your slide view at the moment. Did you, yep, go from there?
Okay, I think this is working. But
there you go, beautiful. You're all good to go. Thank you, Rima.
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me today. I thought before I start today's talk, I really wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal clans who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to the traditions, customs and the knowledge that they've shared. Just a little bit of background. I really respect that today is really a brief talk, and so I will canvass some pretty heavy or, like big notions in a very sort of summarized version. And I'm very mindful of that. And so, if you wanted references or additional information, again, just feel free to reach out. So I work as a psychologist with Fortem Australia, which is a non-for-profit organisation for first responder families, and they essentially look at proactively looking after first responder families and their well-beings. I suppose in thinking about what today's talk, what triggered today's talk, it was looking on at how there are so many factors that are important to help keep people safe, to help keep people staying well who work in this sort of first responder space. And one of those is that sense of belonging, whether that be part of a group, an organisation, whether that's belonging to a land, a culture, whatever that is. And so really thinking about what helps people feel that they are connected or supported or that they belong within that. And so even though I'll be sort of touching on some of those concepts today, and I'm also really mindful that in touching on those, I look at a lot of the research and I try not to get too technical. And some of that research looks at that frontline worker space, the emergency service space. But I'm really aware that a lot of what I talk about is referring to these more globalized contexts of any first responder, whether that's a nurse, whether that's a doctor, whether that's SES, fire and service, defence, border force, whatever that might be. So the terms themselves can be generalised. And so I hope that in some capacity today, the material, you can connect to the material, whatever your role is. And even if that is a support member, particularly support members and first responder family members. I also wanted to flag that Fortem has not produced research papers, but there is a focus on gathering data that aligns with these concepts of organisational and social belongingness and tribe and social connection, and how these are really protective factors to wellbeing and resilience. So I will at times reference anecdotal information from first responder families, and we've received permission to sort of refer to some of that. And if there's time, hopefully I can share a bit more, but we'll see how we go. So I hope the information that at least I share today serves as a reminder that mental health and wellbeing is such a globalised, like a really, really big topic. And this notion that I talk about, this belongingness and connection, is just one aspect of that, but a really important aspect of that. Also, if anything comes up, I think the presenters will, the organisers will provide you some services, so whether that's the suicide prevention hotline, Beyond Blue, etc. So please reach out if anything comes up in relation to that. So this first responder mental health space, obviously it's quite serious and worth talking about. And in terms of giving context to, what we do know exists in terms of to quantify some of this, there was a paper, Answering the Call survey, which was done by Beyond Blue. And the reason I reference this is it's one of the largest that we've had. So it's a mental health and wellbeing study, which was done on police and emergency services, and it's funded by Beyond Blue and the Bushfire National Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. Essentially, over 21,000 former employees and volunteers participated in that, and they generously shared their mental health and wellbeing experiences. And what they found generally, again, was that there was something similar to over 300,000 employees and volunteers in Australia in that first responder sector. Other important findings were that so many people had been impacted that were not just the first responders, but usually their family members or former employees, people who'd been medically discharged on the way through that process. That previously there was no specialised community-based services to support the health and wellbeing of first responder families. So this is a really quite a new phenomenon and sort of space in which we're offering resources. That 1 in 3 first responders experience high levels of psychological distress, and that's more than double the rate of general Australian adult populations. And that there are lots of reasons, and again, I'll go into some of this in a little while, but first responders often report feeling a sense of shame about the mental health challenges that they face, and that they worry that they'll be a huge burden to others. And that will connect a little bit when we talk about connection or disconnection within groups. that many employees and volunteers generally have pretty good mental health and wellbeing, and generally are pretty resilient people. However, there are factors obviously that contribute to why that's not the case. So 1 in 3 employees experience high or really high psychological distress, and much higher than what we talk about, like the average Australian adult. That more than 1 in 2.5 employees and 1 in 3 volunteers report having been diagnosed with a mental health condition in their life. The reason I keep referencing these numbers is it's actually quite high, you know, and it drives home the importance then of looking at what we can be doing better to support and keep people safe, particularly people who are keeping our communities safe. And that the longer that you worked in this space, particularly that first responder space, that the more likely you were to experience symptoms such as PTSD or like a more severe type of PTSD. And that there was a higher rate, again, of suicidal thoughts and plans compared to adults in the general population. We also, I suppose the survey also found that current workers' comp processes was experienced as detrimental to recovery. So it wasn't necessarily the trauma itself, but you know, some of the organisational sort of stresses. That 1 in 4 employees experienced probable PTSD at some point. And that poor workplace practices and culture were found to be damaging to mental health, just as damaging as sometimes occupational trauma. So then if a workplace culture has such a significant impact on mental health, then it's absolutely vital to understand factors related to this and why that's important. So many of the police and emergency service agencies, they're pretty large and complex organisations. They have diverse teams that are spread over like lots of locations, obviously. And attitudes about mental health and wellbeing can vary quite significantly between teams, between individuals, and even within the same workplace. And there is often a culture of trying to be stoic or okay, rather than being accepting of people's vulnerabilities or understanding some of those struggles. And if we know that workplace culture is an important factor to mental health and wellbeing, then a commitment is required from senior leaders as well as teams across the whole agency in order for an agency to effectively embrace policies and programs that promote mental health and wellbeing. So to summarise, I suppose that part of what we learned from answering the core survey supports is that a working environment that supports mental wellbeing can help minimise overall harm, both for individuals but also for groups. And that employees showing high levels of resilience and lower levels of post-traumatic stress severity, more often than not reported working within more cohesive, stronger team environments and felt that other people had their back. And that idea that someone has your back, so to speak, is probably one of these fundamental issues in that idea of how we look at belongingness and tribe. And that tribes actually really matter, not just for people in the frontline space, but just generally for communities and groups. There was a question, I suppose, that someone that got me thinking, which is, you know, if tribes matter, then why is it important to be part of a tribe? And if you think about traditionally this notion of tribe, I'm not sure how other people see it and what comes to mind when, you know, somebody was to ask you a random question like, what is a tribe for you? But I think traditionally it was, if you look at the bottom left picture, it's this idea, it's conceptualized as a hunter-gatherer. And that's a picture from a Tanzanian tribe. And I think if you look at a more modern idea of tribe, it could be, you know, we've moved away quite significantly from this to thinking of tribes in forms of communities, but they're not isolated to communities. It can be families, it can be groups, it can be somewhere that someone belongs, having a shared experience within the emergency service space. It can be a command, a unit, a station, and so forth. And outside of this, a tribe can be a workplace team, it can be your colleagues, your units, for mental health workers, it can be the people that you're working alongside, volunteers, any individuals that essentially work in that frontline space. I mean, the dictionaries sort of talk about tribe as this sort of distinctive or like kind of close-knit group. There's also this reference to a larger family or another group or someone that belongs to something. So the common words that, you know, really sort of stand out is, you know, you've got groups, you've got families, you've got shared culture, you know, just a place where someone belongs. And that's this concept of tribe. So they all work kind of closely together. So this concept of tribe is something that's not new to the human species. That is, by nature, I think we're all tribal in some way, shape or form. And that surviving and being successful within our species comes from this sort of long-standing notion, you know, if we look at neurobiology, that we are a stronger tribe when we have long-lasting social bonds, when we have, you know, really valuable resources, something to contribute, and our ability to work together, actually, that we don't work in isolation when we're part of a tribe. And if we look at thousands of years ago, a lot of, how we think, how our bodies react, you know, whether it's fight, flight, etc. And some of that's been touched on in other presentations. And some of our survival depends on that. For our early ancestors, I suppose, you know, belonging to a tribe was essential for survival. So if you didn't essentially belong to a tribe, you would die. You would die of starvation because nobody had your back. You would die of exposure because there was no one to protect you, etc. So if we're evolutionary hardwired to be quite sensitive to our status within a tribe, and our survival depends on whether we are in or out of a tribe, and I think that's really important for first responders whose culture is naturally tribal in nature. So the stronger the tribe, the stronger someone's connection is to that tribe, and then the more protective that is for the individual and their well-being. So some of the research, again, without getting overly technical, looks at the importance of what they call, and this kind of closely relates to tribe belongingness among frontline workers. And they look at that concept of workplace belongingness. And essentially what that looks at is somebody's, the way in which somebody perceives, or the way that they see that they are valued, the way that they see that they are respected, and the way that they are accepted by others in the organisation. So the more I feel someone cares about what I'm doing, they're respecting who I am, what I'm doing, my purpose and my role, and I'm accepted, then there are strong connections with that and the way in which somebody might respond or experience traumatic stress. So when they look at emergency services in Australia, that space, they have shown that people who have that strong sense of organisational belongingness, that has had a hugely positive impact on the health and wellbeing of those members. So if somebody went through extreme or chronic stress, or they had an adverse experience or trauma, then often it can lead someone to feel different or disconnected from their peers or from others. And in response, they can try and protect themselves by either pushing people away, whether that's intentional or whether that's unintentional. And frontline workers who felt connected with their peers, so this is sort of, I suppose, the flip side, and had that sense of belonging, were more likely to experience that pleasure and satisfaction in their work. They were more likely to be more resilient to things like operational stress, organisational stress, and even external traumatic stress, and they were less likely to experience burnout. So in some of the research, people who reported not feeling like they belonged, so they had a low sense of belonging, they were more likely to have things like anxiety and depression. So the finding is also consistent with when you look at other literature. Again, I won't sort of offer too many references, but can. It essentially indicates that belongingness acts as that kind of buffer between the stress from an organisation or the trauma and then well-being. So the stronger that buffer, the stronger that sense of belonging, then the stronger the well-being, and therefore the less depressive symptoms, the less anxiety symptoms, etc. Why is that? I suppose it's a complex notion, but our bodies are like these stress systems, and they need a lot of resources to stay strong. Our minds need resources to stay strong, so do our bodies, etc. And so if they are resource-based, when we're feeling quite overwhelmed, when we're feeling really pressured, when we're feeling unsupported, etc., then we need to rely on certain things to kind of refuel that. And some of those things, when we look at sort of a top-down approach, is, one of them is social support, which refuels our stress system. But things also like psychological first aid, having trust in the organisation that they will have your back and you'll be supported. Now, there are some strategies to improve a sense of workplace belongingness in that emergency service space, such as the ones I've just sort of touched on, particularly when someone's repeatedly exposed to potentially traumatic events. And they can be things like I mentioned, psychological first aid and social support, but it's also things like activities and positive reinforcement, things that promote someone feeling valued and supported, included, particularly following traumatic events, that even though people need that more globally and more consistently and generally, that in response to a trauma or in response to an emergency or whatever that might be, and even in response to supporting somebody going through that, people need to feel that they are supported and cared about. And there was a recent study that was done only in 2019 that highlighted that, you know, when you look at treatment or interventions designed to foster that healthy kind of disclosure, you know, talking about what's happened, not with poor boundaries, but being able to safely do so, but doing that with using social supports, that was found to promote that belongingness and then the subsequent benefits that came from that. And I suppose that also then drills home this idea that early intervention after a disaster or trauma is extremely important. So while I don't have time today to explore psychological first aid in great detail, one component that is relevant in the context of understanding the concept of tribe is the importance of establishing that sense of safety for people in reducing the risk of re-traumatising individuals. So if we look at this research that looks at the factors that contribute to the risk of psychological injury amongst emergency services, and conversely research into what bolsters resilience to traumatic stress, both support the importance of social support factors within that peri-traumatic, which is around the time of the trauma environment. So having that support can lead people to feel both more resilient to the traumatic stress that they're exposed to, but it also ties into the Answering the Call survey that links such factors to reducing anxiety and depression. So people with better social relationships who feel more connected and have a sense of belonging and joint purpose in their work teams are then more happier, more resilient to significant and often the relentless stress of the emergency service space. And emergency service workers who often hold values that relate to integrity, to trust, to camaraderie, working towards like a greater good, it's not rocket science then that offering a workplace and being part of a group that practices those values enables them to connect with one another, but also to the mission to promote their own well-being or their own satisfaction. Again, I'm mindful that there's a lot of information at the moment, and I'm mindful as well that, you know, I've talked about some factors that relate to belongingness, etc., and then thinking about how to make that applicable. You know, how do we then apply what we know, what's both needed from a leader perspective, but also then individually and as families. Well, I suppose one factor that's relevant in exploring how to improve that belongingness is the importance of building really good, strong, cohesive groups within organisational teams. We know that groups bond together to defend against threat. You know, this is why injured members, they kind of bond around shared grievances, about being let down, about being betrayed. And we want to be really careful to foster that cohesion, that strength within groups, to help people open up to the outside, socially to the outside world and outside of the group, to form those stronger ties, to become better able to relate to themselves, to their tribe, but also to other tribes, you know, external to that. And within a group space by nature, I think when you think about connection and belongingness in groups, because a lot of the work that is done is usually looking at the wider group, usually people who have those strong values of integrity and trust, etc., they're quite committed, which means if they turn up to a group, you know, they'll commit to that group. They might be part of that group, whether that's active or passive. So even if it's just them turning up, you don't have to do much, even just merely being present. That can lead to improving bonds around similar interests and values that relate to pride, dignity, loyalty, and honesty. So through groups, we see that people usually, they watch other members get involved, and that encourages their own social and interpersonal skills. That activates that system in us. It helps them kind of maybe move out of being more internalised, you know, keeping things in, and might help them start to share verbally rather than remaining isolated. So showing up in and of itself sometimes is part of the work, because it gets you away from whatever space that is, particularly if you're being quite disconnected. It can promote what we call that vicarious learning, like learning through other people. And in doing so, that then improves your own well-being. And it helps to connect with like-minded people who may have insight into what you've been through, into other similar experiences. And so a stronger, more connected group allows people to feel more resilient and have better response to traumatic stress.
We've just got 5 minutes, Rima, just so you know. So there were some questions coming through, but wonderful.
Okay, I'll kind of wrap up shortly. So then, how do we then think about ways in which to promote some of that group cohesiveness and a stronger sense of belonging? Again, from all kinds of levels. It's, you know, encouraging mutual positive feelings between people, developing that kind of group pride, you know, that sense of we, us, things that we all have in common, things that have united you together to bring you there, recognising and celebrating similarities amongst people, and having collective goals and commitments to shared outcomes. So that way people work together to make an effort to achieve something. And so and that's, I suppose, where we talk about, I can talk a little bit about Fortem, but having activities that promote that independence, where members are working together through an activity, you know, engaging in tasks. You need each other in order to achieve an eventual outcome. So if people feel isolated, or in terms of ideas around how to promote that workplace belongingness and that psychological wellbeing in the first responder space, you know, I talked a bit about activities, but activities are things that people do together, families do together, parents and children, colleagues with colleagues, strangers. Positive reinforcement that promotes that sense of value and support. Organisations that have like incentives, welfare schemes, team building, social clubs, having really a strong sense of team identity within the workplace that really helps forge those relationships. So connecting to community organisations that also offer services for first responder families. And there are more and more of those emerging as time goes on. And anything ideally that helps bring people together rather than reinforcing any kind of disconnection. I suppose that's the ultimate aim. I won't talk about Fortem in too much detail, but there is some sort of slides there if people access them later. But we have something like, to date, something over 3,500 participants who are involved in various activities. And I won't go into all the specifics, but I have received permission. There are so many quotes, but the point is that a lot of people report certain themes, and whether that relates to getting out of their comfort zone, connecting, feeling safe, having fun. I think having fun is is quite important, because having fun strongly relates to just letting go a little bit and just forming some sort of easy relationships. And this is a quote that someone wrote who engaged in a Sydney rock climbing activity, and they've said, "This isn't an activity that I'd normally have chosen for myself, but by attending with my family, having a go, it not only got me out of the house, it got me active, but it allowed me to try something very much out of my comfort zone and help build confidence and skills. By meeting up with a colleague too, it allowed us to have some time not only with family doing a fun activity, but it gave us time to chat and catch up too." So again, like just that idea that it doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be this overly complex therapeutic approach, but sometimes just engaging in an activity, connecting, can actually target so many layers of our well-being. And I suppose conversely, something that sort of staff often talk about are those silly moments of connection, having fun. Something that somebody recently said was something that really stood out to me during activities is the way participants unite in the moment. And how this appears to create a real sense of camaraderie and genuine connection between first responders. And that giving them a space to do so allows them just by nature to form a sense of organic connection. And I could go on for a really long time, but I might just stop there.
That's amazing. Thank you, Rima. And so, like you said, so much to continue in terms of our conversation and our discussion. So absolutely respect that. Thank you. You can stop your slideshow now if you wish, my dear. The themes that really resonated with me was that proactive focus that Fortem has, which is so consistent with Wellbeing Australia. Our focus is, what do we do proactively to move forward rather than getting bogged down in that conversation about what's going wrong? And some great questions have come through that we might need to come to at the end of Lynn's session, which really highlight how do I work if I'm doing everything I can and I see this sense of belonging and that connection, but the culture I'm in is toxic or bullying and whatnot. And I think that leads us beautifully into Lynn joining us for our second part of our session, Lynn is going to be sharing with us more about what is solution focused. What does it mean to be solution focused? And how can I basically utilize the concept of solution focus within my day and my life? So Lynn, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you introduce a little bit more about what you've been doing and your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's really wonderful to be here. I'll start with showing my screen so that people can see the screen as well as myself. And make sure that I'm doing a...
Don't we love technology? It's so clever.
There you go. Okay, so my name's Lynn Worsley and I work at the Resilience Centre.
And that's not popped up onto the presenter mode. Just if you can try one more time, sometimes they get a bit stuck before.
Did it not go in presenter mode?
No, I've got the slides on the side showing.
All right, let's go presenter mode. How's that?
That's beautiful, thank you.
Okay, so there we go. So this is a picture of myself and also the team, half of our team at the Resilience Centre, where we run a psychology service which runs therapy and research and training. But particularly we enjoy working with people who are from all walks of life. My own background is as a registered nurse. I have worked in accident and emergency. I've worked in accident and emergency in mental health as well. And also as a registered nurse, moved into education and then have now taken on clinical psychology and the director of the Resilience Centre. So I have a number of hats that I come to this presentation with. And I'm hoping I'll be able to share a lot of those stories in different ways and welcome your questions at the end. But before we start, Warami Nalawa Midiga, which is the Darug language, which is used by the Waramariko people that are in the area that I live right now. And one of the term Warami Nalawa Midiga means let's just sit down and share stories. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land who did that and went through many areas, many situations of adversity. So let's start the screen and look at some people who are resilient and people who have gone through significant adversity. I think each of you can probably name each of these people. One of the things that I think is common for all of them is that they all had levels of connection with people. The top left-hand corner, you see Sophie D'Alessio, who's gone through so many aspects of trauma, yet has maintained this positive aspect of her life and attitude, and has a language that she speaks. And I think one of the things that we can see in each of the people as well is that really what we can have is learn is how to look at adversity in a different way. I'm not going to go through each of their stories, but for those people who are watching, you can have a little go and see if you can guess each person on the screen and think about what it is that actually enabled them to survive and thrive. So we're going to look at resilience. My area of study is in resilience. I particularly have been drawn to working with youth and for people who struggle with various aspects of their mental health. And I'm really interested in those people who survive and thrive. So when we think about the bell curve, most of us are in the middle of the bell curve. I'm looking at the people who've gone through an enormous amount of trauma and significant adversity. And the bell curve is that, most people, do sort of bounce back occasionally after a while. Some people don't do so well, but the other end are those people who actually do incredibly well despite the adversity, a bit like the pictures that we just saw earlier. And so the research around that is so interesting, and it gives us so much that we can copy, we can emulate, we can form our programs and our processes around that. So the three aspects of studying those people is that they had a level of personal competence that builds their skills, social skills in particular. They're able to work with social resources around them, and so that the social resources are actually quite good, and they go through a tough time. So not going through adversity is not going to help your resilience. So if we look at that, adversity becomes a little bit of an opportunity and not a threat for us to develop our skills. So for those people in frontline, you're doing it all the time. You're going through adversity, you're watching people's adversity, and you're gathering the skills and you're gathering the team around you in order to manage to cope. And each time you go through a bit of a dip, it's an opportunity to build up more skills and to gather in your tribe. There are multiple pathways for everybody, so don't think there's a particular recipe. But one of the things that we did notice in all of the research is that those who show greater resilience in difficulties, they demonstrate an optimistic language and they continue to have hope. So people started to think, is it a personality trait? Is it something that we are born with? And the answer is no, no, no. It's something that we interact with in our environment and we gather from our tribe. So thank you, Rima. You're speaking the same language as me. So when we start looking at the resilience response, people who've been affected by terror attacks or bushfires and floods, and people affected by war, because there's stacks of research on that, we look at 4 different ways that they do that. They might bounce back after the traumatic stress and seem to recover quite well. They might sustain themselves through chronic stress. So people who've got chronic, or looking after people with a chronic illness, or people who've been in a situation where they're continually in a war zone. That's like a sustainability. The other one is that some people are just seem to have a natural tendency to look for growth in response to stress. And there are those who just resist. So let's just have a quick look at how each of them think and have conversations. Before we do that, you can see the graph. What's really interesting in this graph is that this is stress symptoms on the left and over time on the right. And as you can see, most come back. The people that come back quickly are those who are resistant, the deniers, and those people who have a point of like the growth. But the recovery ones, they take a while to come back, and people who are in chronic stress tend to manage their stress by sustaining certain things. And so we learn a lot in that research, and the research that we have, particularly in the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York, we see that most people came back and were seen as resilient, and only 6% of those people that had significant trauma, these are the people who lived nearby, only 6% had PTSD, which was really quite interesting. I think that was quite low. So what they did was that they studied the cortisol levels in people. So when the stress occurs, your cortisol level goes high, it stops you from having infections, it keeps you all alert and you're on fire all the time, and then it drops. If you're in a recovery zone and you do well, it drops back when you feel safe. And so what they found was that particularly in the 9/11, there was an enormous amount of social support. There was an enormous amount of personal connection. There were people that were handing in support and giving encouragement right from the very start. And that set up an optimistic thinking pattern and a high level of engagement. So many tribes were formed and they were able to lean in and have conversations that focused on hope. So this whole situation, while we thought it would have been disastrous for people, there was low levels of PTSD in that situation because of the tribal mentality that happened. When we have studies looking at Australian staff, we look at Victorian bushfires, which has got lots of research, and we'll be getting more research from the recent bushfires in 2019 and 20. But what we've got in 2009 was that the recovery in those areas was about local connections. So the ability for the tribes to regroup. What we also noticed in the Queensland floods in 2011, there was very little post-traumatic stress. And that was due to the fact that people came out and supported each other and there were local connections. Again, this tribe mentality that helped build that optimism. In Japan, the social capital, they kept talking about social capital, which basically is another way of saying tribal connections. The connected communities together, those people who were in their connected communities bounced back a bit quicker. Those who'd been separated from their communities due to the tsunami, they did not cope so well. So that was the first one. When we think about one way is to recover or bounce back, another way is what do you do when you're having to see trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, and what happens when you have to go through something that's a long term. Now we get the Stockdale effect here. The Stockdale effect was really about how did these men who were in the prisoner of war in Vietnam manage to cope so well when everybody else in the same prison did not get post-traumatic stress. Now, Stockdale had this little group, none of them had any signs of anxiety or post-traumatic stress or any signs of any mental illness, whereas everyone else did. And so when they undid what he did, the strategies that he had for survival were about the conversations they had when they lay together at night talking about their situation. And this brings us to, how do we have these conversations when we're right in the midst of a crisis? What he said was that no one was allowed to say, we'll be out by Easter, or we'll be out by Christmas, or we'll be out by Thanksgiving, or anything like that. Everyone had to say what they would do when they got out. So it was almost like, yeah, we're going through this terrible time now, but we're going to jump over it and imagine what it will be like when we're out. And so someone would say, oh, I'm going to open a business. I want to open a little shop, but I'm really bad at accounts. And someone else would say, I'm an accountant. Hey, why don't we meet up a little bit and we'll just talk numbers and I can teach you about balancing the books and so on. Oh, okay. So they had this thought of, I'm preparing for something that's going to happen when we're out of here. So they had this sense of looking for a positive future and looking at strategies to move towards that future, but in the meantime, facing the brutal facts. We're in a prisoner of war camp. There are a whole lot of things we need to do in order to survive because we want to get to this preferred future. Now, hold on to that thought for a minute, because that is so exciting for us to go, okay, how do I cope in the midst of a crisis that feels like it's never going to end, like long-term bushfires, like situations where we're just going to have to try and respond, and this is seeming like there doesn't seem to be an end to it. When we think about how will it be at the end of that, that may actually mean we can practice a conversation around that. So hold on to that idea. What was interesting in the research is that the people who seem to resist seem to hold on to their resilience quite well. And this is like a sense of denial, like I'm not really thinking about this. I'm just waiting for a new system to get in place, and then I'll respond and change my behavior. So this is particularly in response to change, or for those people who are going through grief, this sense of it didn't really happen almost is a lovely lull time. They're able to do a lot in that sort of denial phase. It's actually really helpful for them in terms of being able to set a whole lot of systems in place when they do finally work out what's going on. But the resistant people amongst us in our organizations are often the people that you go, oh, they're blocking everything. But oftentimes they're managing their resilience in a lot better way than we think. So I thought that was interesting as well. But the final way that we look at here is those people who seem to have a propensity towards growth. When something happens, they seem to think about it as being growth. And I remember working with a lady one time who had a terrible cancer. And she had a faith, and her faith was really holding her. And I asked her about it. It's like, how does it hold you? And she said, well, it's not about what the outcome is going to be. It's really about who I am in the process. And so her sense of this is actually going to help me grow is a really, really unusual thinking, but one that is seen with people who are in that end of that spectrum, where they end of the bell curve, who actually seem to manage to change and accommodate and become much more optimistic. So people with the growth mentality, They deal directly with the difficulties. They seem to achieve balance much quicker. They're more concerned with what they're gaining rather than what they're losing. They have a sense of their preferred future. They see adversity as an opportunity and not a threat, which I think is really cool. And I love using that term a lot, particularly as I'm doing therapy. But they had hope-filled conversations that were much more optimistic. And I think that also talks to us, is that what does a hope-filled conversation look like? So when we look at those 4 different ways of responding to stress, the one that is the most interesting and the one that recovers quicker is this growth mentality. This people who had this opportunity rather than a threat mentality, and the conversations that they had there. And as you can see, the others all come back to normal, but not nearly as quickly as this one. So what about us? How do we implement recovery, sustainability, resistance, and perhaps even growth and resilience as frontline workers and first attenders? So one of the things we need to think through is, what is your normal reaction to stress? Now, I know when I was nursing, I almost, like, this sounds crazy, but when I was working in accident emergency and I'd hear the ambulance coming in, I'd think, oh, what is this going to be? It was almost like, I've got to get ready, and my adrenaline starts pumping and I've got everything there ready. And at the time when I was nursing, which is a long time ago, I would have my trolleys ready. I would work out whether it was a heart attack or whether it was somebody who's motor vehicle accident. I'd be working out, thinking straight away, my reaction is get ready and be ready to respond. And one of the conversations would be, is how do you think we might be able to help here? Or are you ready? Are you okay? Yes, let's go. And there's that sense of camaraderie when we're working with a team, but that sense of readiness, I know I had. But there are times when it's like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do here. I don't know where to start. That is also like, I'm paralyzed because I'm not quite sure what to do. Now that is also about training, but afterwards, what is my reaction to the stress? How do I come back? How do I drop my adrenaline level? What happens when I drop my adrenaline? Do I burst into tears and keep seeing things, or do I wait? And I remember very distinctly that I always had this sense of delayed reaction. 2 weeks later, I would have some flashbacks. 2 weeks later, I would have a sense of, I don't know why I'm so upset about things at the moment. And there's that sense of, okay, I've just come back to normal and now it's starting to hit me. And once I'd worked that out, it was a case of 2 weeks later, just make sure I'm catching up with a couple of friends and I'm putting in place a little bit of self-care, because I know that things aren't going to be real good for me in 2 weeks' time. And giving myself that space, it's not about not coping, it's about actually reading how I was going to cope, how I was going to recover. I loved this book. I don't know if anyone has read this. This was a great holiday read for me. It was called The Happiest Man on Earth. And this is about Eddie Yaku, who was a prisoner of war in Auschwitz. And he's 100 years old. And he talks about his journey through that. And he even has situations where he's able to respond to other people's stress in a way by giving them strategies. So it's a great read, and he finds meaning very quickly in his whole journey. And that would be really helpful for people to read as to how he managed things. But let's look at solution-focused approach. Now, a solution-focused approach has what you call best case scenario thinking. Now, best case scenario thinking is the opposite to risk thinking. What we're taught is to look at our risk and then assess the risk and respond to the risk. Well, that is actually what you would call the worst case scenario thinking. When we're talking best case scenario, you're starting to go on a different end of the spectrum. Is that what could be useful in this situation? If this is a terrible situation, what's the best thing that can come out of it? In this terrible situation, how can I make good use of now for a better future? So think Stockdale. Best case scenario thinking is, what would I do with this situation if I thought it was helpful? So if you thought the situation was actually helpful, what would I do differently? Now, this is really crazy thinking when you think about, you know, you're looking at a situation and you're feeling like you're falling apart. How can this be actually helpful? What might be good about this situation? And that's what best case scenario tends to make you do. You have to practice it. But a way to get there is to start thinking about how to have solution-focused conversations. Now, solution-focused conversations are intentional. They're not accidental. They're intentional and they're positive and pragmatic. And when we're saying pragmatic, it's like stating the bleeding obvious, looking at what's in front of you and seeing it, and then working out how you might be able to find some sense of meaning or purpose or way through it. It's looking at the future possibilities as a result of the situation. You might be looking for positive change. You might be optimizing success where you see it. It might be that in the midst of a crisis, you feel like you just did something really well and you're optimizing that and you're building on that. It's like nailing down, what did I do that worked in this situation? What can I do next? So the basic idea of solution-focused approach is this. It's the difference between problem-focused and solution-focused. When you're problem-focused, your conversations are around, so what happened in the past, what's wrong, who's to blame, you know, how can we get some control out of this? I must try and get an expert, you know, maybe we need to go to some fancy psychologist and they can tell us what to do. It's like finding the deficits in the whole situations and how we might be able to fix it. And then we might get see how the complications come in and we can define it all. Now that's problem focused and it gets us nowhere. It actually makes us feel worse. The solution focused is quite different. It's like, you know, what do you hope for in the future? So what, in the process of what you're going through right now, in the midst of this crisis, what do you think you're doing that's working? How have you progressed as you're going through this terrible situation? You know, what's influencing you towards, you know, what's working? Well, who's helping? Who are you collaborating with? Who are the best people you've got in your team? And what resources could you use and have used at the moment to be able to get to where you are? What's a simple thing you might be able to do to make a change? The solution focused also works with actions. What could you do that might make things just a slightly bit better? Now, those conversations around that are when you have different questions. And I quite like unpacking questions. And when I'm problem focused, and everyone is a little bit problem focused because it's really interesting to know what was wrong and why are things so bad and how long has things been going wrong and who's, you know, when are they most extreme and how can we blame somebody and what are the causes and what maybe I've got some personal deficits. All of that just makes you get buried into a hole and makes you have no reason to get out. But if you actually ask solution-focused questions, you're asking, what do you want instead of the problem? Describe to me in detail what you would really like to have happen instead of this problem. Another way would be, you know, the problem is pretty obvious and you can't change it, but how would you be if the problem wasn't there? And what would indicate to you that in answer to that above question that this was a bit of a solution? If you didn't have the problem or you weren't responding to the problem and you were back into your own self, despite the fact that you're going through some difficulties, what would you notice? What would you notice first? What would be the smallest change you might put in place? What would other people notice about you or about the situation if the problem wasn't so dominant in your response? Your attention is on the solution, not on the problem that's in front of you. So the solution focused has an urge to be trying to be really useful. And the pragmatics, and particularly as me in my nursing hat, the pragmatic is, what's helpful now? What can I do that's right helpful now? But the clinical psych for me now goes, how is what you're doing right now going to be useful for the future when the problem no longer exists? And what will be happening 10 years' time when all this is over, if you saw that what you're going through now is an opportunity and not a threat? Now, I have used those last two questions over and over with people who are going through diagnoses of cancer, or parents who are going to be leaving their children due to cancer. And those situations are like traumatic, or a child who's going through some terrible difficulties. What will be happening 10 years when you thought this was an opportunity and not a threat? What would be different? What story would you like to be able to tell? Now, all of that is deep, but they're quick. Whereas the problem focus gets you stuck on the problem and doesn't take you to where you want to go. Some of the solution-focused conversations tap very quickly to the core of what's going on. We used to call it, or we still do at times, brief therapy, because there's a speed of getting to the core. And there is an organisation called Brief in the UK, and they have just one session with a client. They say with one session, we need to be able to turn that person's thinking around and leave them with the agency to be able to make a change. And they do very successful work. And so this is why it's really helpful for frontline workers, is that you can actually have conversations that make very quick changes just on the field. One comment that can cause a shift in thinking when someone goes, oh, I'm sick of this. It could be, what would you like instead? I'd like this, this, and this, and this. Okay. And that's just almost like, I'm not focusing on what I'm sick of. I'm actually focusing now on what I'd like to have instead. It may be enough to just turn your head towards the hope. One of the questions that I love asking, okay, just 5 minutes?
Only 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, one of the questions that is really asked a lot in solution-focused conversations is that what if a miracle happened? What it would look like? How would you be different? And what if you, in the miracle, was able to be in this terrible situation? How would you approach this differently? So this is where, what if I was coping? Well, how would you be coping? If you knew that your coping self was able to cope with this situation, how would you approach that differently? Great question, great thing to reflect on. The other thing that solution focused use all the time is a scale, 0 to 10. 0 is the worst case scenario, 10 is like the miracle. And what number are you at now? It might be that I'm at about a 5. So you ask, so how did you get there? Who helped? What did you do to get to 5? What stopped you from getting worse? So that gives you all the information that you might need in order to move forward. Now I'm going to stop there because I think I've done my 3 minutes. Is that right?
It is. The time just vanishes, doesn't it?
It does.
If I can get you to stop screen sharing just so we can pop back up. Thank you. It's amazing, Lynn. And I think there's so much to continue that discussion. The questions that came through were brilliant. So thank you everyone for those questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to ask them or to answer because there was just so much wealth in both of those presentations, but we will come back to you all. So please know we will come back on responses. And they were brilliant questions around how do we start this? If we decide that solution focus is something that appeals to us, what are we going to do to be able to actually start that process? What do I do in my own space? So definitely something that's a key conversation that we will continue. And for everyone who shared questions, we will make sure that we come back to you all with those questions responded to. So that's excellent. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Rima, for helping. In terms of what will happen next, just so that everyone knows, when you finish on this session with us, you will be offered the chance to respond to a survey. It's a few questions. It can be anonymous. It's incredibly valuable in us continuing this conversation. So those questions that you've shared in the chat and the Q&A function have been captured and will be included in our next steps and conversations. But we really do ask you to share your feedback in the survey and any more information you're wishing so that we can continue to provide you with those solutions. Now, as Rima mentioned in the beginning, if you are feeling that you are vulnerable or in a space where you're needing to talk to someone and you want some support and help, here are some suggestions in terms of where you can go to. There's a wealth of knowledge of people who can be helping and can continue to help you in that space as well. So please do reach out for help if you feel the need for it. In terms of other sort of follow-on, and that the conversation from both of you, Lynn and Rima, was just so gold in terms of that reminder of where we're coming from, and very consistent with those themes and comments we're hearing back from our participants about what's important to them and what is helping and hindering them in managing their own well-being better. So I think it does give us some really good food for thought about what we're going to do next. In terms of everything else, for those that have attended the session, please know that everything that has been shared or viewed over the last few days is accessible on the recordings that are on our website as well. The session we ran on PTSD yesterday had some great comments around solution-focused conversation. So for some of you who were commenting on your own experience, I would encourage you to have a look at that as well. It may be just a really good starting point in terms of where you can be coming from. So thank you all. It's been a wonderful discussion and lots of opportunity for thoughts. We will see you at our next session. Thank you.